Bipole III, where the rubber hits the road. We call this presentation Where the Rubber Hits the Road because the decision to run this industrial hydro line down the west side of the province rather than the east side of Lake Winnipeg is an example of what has to be done if we're to take the rights of First Nations and the environment seriously. We need Bipole III because we have to improve the security of our power supply in southern Manitoba, and we are increasing our exports. We have $4 billion in hand with signed contracts in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Manitoba Hydro's 2 existing bipole transmission lines are carried by 2 rows of identical steel towers which follow an 895-kilometer route from Gillam southward through the Interlake region. Here you can see that the 2 bipoles run side by side. The problem is that if there's an extreme weather event or severe forest fire, it will affect both the bipoles. These bipoles provide southern Manitoba with 75% of its power, so we have to have an alternate source to ensure our power security. Going down the west side is going to be more expensive than going down the east side, approximately $650 million to $690 million more. But when we take some very important opportunity costs into consideration, the equation and the solution change. We put this analysis into a sustainable development framework to help us understand it better. Sustainable development uses a triple bottom line. It considers economic, social, and environmental aspects, not just economic. Let's look at some of the ecosystem services that are provided by the east side of Lake Winnipeg. I took some information from a very important report called The Carbon the World Forgot. In this report, there are 4 core messages, but I'm just going to look at 2 of them for the purposes of this presentation. First of all, the global boreal region is the world's largest terrestrial carbon storehouse, and it contains almost twice as much carbon per unit area as tropical forests. It's also important to avoid disturbing the boreal forest's vast carbon reservoirs in order to avoid accelerating climate change. The second core message from this report is that climate change has severe implications for boreal diversity and ecosystem services. However, Canada's boreal forest region is better suited than most to withstand climate impacts due to its high level of intactness. So what is an intact forest? Well, here's a definition. As you can see, it's a contiguous mosaic of naturally occurring ecosystems in a forest ecozone, essentially undisturbed by significant human influence. An intact forest landscape consists of a mosaic of natural ecosystems, including forest, bog, water, tundra, and rock outcrops. In some cases, only 20 or 30% of the total area may consist of trees. An intact forest landscape has the following characteristics. It is free from substantial anthropogenic fragmentation, such as power lines. It's free from substantial human influence for periods that ensure it is formed by naturally occurring ecological processes, and it's large enough to be resilient to edge effects such as climate change and to survive most natural disturbance events. Now, it's often argued that this area is not pristine because of the presence of roads, non-industrial power lines, and some infrastructure for camping, etc. We argue that the development in this area is not yet at the point that we could classify it as substantial, and that what is there is to serve the First Nations communities who have lived there for thousands of years. Also, infrastructure that supports First Nations is considered essential in the UNESCO World Heritage Site application. According to CPAWS, which is the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, the woodland caribou, which is listed nationally and provincially as threatened, needs intact forest to survive. The east side of Lake Winnipeg is the most southern intact boreal forest in the world, and it acts as a safe haven for species that are pushed north by climate change. The opposite of an intact forest is a fragmented forest, and an intact forest landscape fragment is different from an intact landscape in that it alone may not be large enough to support viable populations of most native species associated with the ecosystem, and may not necessarily be large enough to be resilient to edge effects or to survive most natural disturbance events. The more cuts there are in a forest, the worse it is, and the wider the cut, the worse it is. Here's a closer look at the area we're concerned with. The dark orange here refers to high levels of soil organic carbon mass. The peat and bogs in this forest provide an invaluable service by sequestering carbon for us. You'll note that the east side of Lake Winnipeg and north part of Manitoba have the darkest orange. The west side, on the other hand, is mixed with farmland, mining, roadways, settlements, and some boreal forest. This is not to say that there are no ecologically valuable places on the west side. There are. The point is that this area is not intact. The east side is. Duty to consult. I don't think we can exaggerate this next section too much, the duty to consult with First Nations. All it takes is one First Nation to be opposed to a bipole line, and we have a problem. The truth of the matter is that we have more than one that is opposed. Duty to consult refers to our duty under the Constitution to consult with First Nations communities. It also refers to the Northern Flood Agreement and to benefit agreements that are required whenever we have development on First Nations territories. An example of what is achieved when we do consultation with First Nations is Asatiwisipe, a key management plan. In June of this year, the Popular River First Nations Community Plan was validated under the East Side Traditional Lands Planning and Special Areas Act. This act prohibits industrial hydro lines. Bloodvein First Nation, further south, is currently working with the government to establish a similar management plan. These management plans will form part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site application, which will be submitted in 2012. Why the east side for a World Heritage Site? The UNESCO World Heritage Site applications are submitted under particular categories. The application for the east side of Lake Winnipeg, called Pimacho-Wenaki, will be considered for its cultural and natural significance. The World Conservation Union, which evaluates the UNESCO World Heritage Site applications, will be asking, does this area contain cultural or natural significance which is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity? As such, the permanent protection of this area should be of the highest importance to the international community as a whole. An industrial power line would negatively impact both cultural and natural values. Under the UNESCO World Heritage Site application, the area will be judged by its present condition. Changes could jeopardize designation, and we saw this in Newfoundland with Grossmorn Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The province wanted to run a hydro line through this UNESCO World Heritage Site, but had they done so, they would have lost designation. The province decided to reroute the hydro line down a longer, more expensive route so that this area would not lose its designation. The map on the left shows the First Nations and provincial parks that are part of the UNESCO application. Poplar River, which is the First Nations involved in the Asatiwisipe a key management plan, is the most northerly First Nation, and their territory spans that portion of the province. Given that they do not want bipole to go through their land, and given that the East Side Traditional Lands Planning and Special Areas Act does not allow industrial power lines, it is not clear how Bipole 3 could be routed on the east side. The map on the right shows where Bipole would run if it did go down the east side. UNESCO monitors World Heritage Sites and puts them on a danger list if certain things occur that change the site too much, such as a serious decline in the population of endangered species, or the severe deterioration of the natural beauty or scientific value, as by human settlement, industrial and agricultural development, and major public works. This is taken directly from the Manitoba Sustainable Development Act. It talks about how Manitobans should think globally when acting locally, recognizing that there is economic, ecological, and social interdependence between provinces and nations. Who cares what environmentalists say? When we consider issues like Bipole III, whether we like it or not, we have to consider the many stakeholders there are out there. Those stakeholders include environmental groups from Canada, such as the Canadian Boreal Initiative, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, the David Suzuki Foundation, and the Sierra Club of Canada. But it also includes international groups, such as the Natural Resource Defence Council, the Pew Environmental Group, and potentially even environmental groups from Europe. The National Resource Defence Council is classified as the most powerful environmental group in the United States. This slide just shows a bit of their website, and the top half of the page explains the heart of the boreal forest. At the right, you can see the Take Action button. This allows you to send a message to Premier Selinger. He has received over 70,000 messages from people who are concerned about the boreal forest. This organization is also aligned with Poplar River First Nation. In fact, they talk specifically about Poplar River on this website. We have recently finalized contracts for over $4 billion in export sales to Wisconsin and Minnesota. Manitoba Hydro CEO Bob Brennan said that the province's power is increasingly in demand as U.S. states start regulating how much of their energy must come from renewable resources. The Wisconsin legislature just approved large hydro to be a renewable source. In a press release, Minnesota Power said the deal fits with the utility's strategy of lessening its dependence on carbon-based generation. So Wisconsin has to buy renewable energy. And in order for Wisconsin to be able to classify Manitoba hydro exports as renewable, we have to comply with wishes of First Nations. Environmental groups in these states are watching us closely and are aligned with certain First Nations on the east side. We've looked at some of the environmental and social costs of going down the east side, but what are the accounting costs of going down the east side? We have to remember that there will be associated costs of undertaking other environmental and regulatory approvals, of new routing studies, of new public consultation processes and separate Section 35 consultations, of new benefit agreements, and there will be costs of potential of losing export sales. This begs the question as to whether or not it's even possible to go down the east side, because these costs will likely dwarf the $680 million difference of going down the west side. So as we can see, we cannot leave environmental and social costs out of our calculus, and we have to include deep ecological concepts like fragmentation in our analysis. When we do this deeper sort of analysis, we get a more complete picture of this issue. We need to remember that all Manitobans are watching.